I've invited David Bradbury in. I think this is the one remaining section we have. And, you know, it's section 13 of the bill. David, maybe if you don't mind just spending a few minutes just walking us through this section as you read it and understand it from the House. Uh, we haven't spent a lot of time on this. So I'd like to just start there and then we'll hear from David, his perceptions, and if there are any questions, we'll move on. Appropriations has put the $900,000 in general fund to recapitalize the fund, if that's the proper word. So David, maybe we can pull section 13 up on the screen and you can walk us through that.
We're in the land of multiple Davids. Are you referring to me?
I am. Who's the other David?
David
Oh,
Bradbury.
David Bradbury, right. I'm sorry. Yes, I was referring to David Hall.
The person who will run the $900,000 program.
Gotcha. Okay.
Yeah, I'm happy to pull that up.
And if you could give us what your limited knowledge is of in terms of background of this fund and project and
yeah, I mean, you really do have the
expert. I know we have the expert
in
with
the
us.
room. But just, I guess, as a sort of a historical perspective, remember that the Entrepreneurs Seed Capital Fund is something that is envisioned as a function of statute through VITA, right? So 10 VSA chapter, gosh, what is it, 15, I think, creates this, the legislature created the Vermont Economic Development Authority as sort of this freestanding entity many years ago. And then over time, the scope of what VITA has done has expanded, but also the legislature has expanded and charged VITA with the mission of creating certain entities, subsidiaries almost, and breathing life into those, and then those have their own missions. And the Seed Capital Fund was one of those creations. So if you go to the statutes, what you'll see is that VITA is directed to create this non-profit organization that will do the things that have become what the Entrepreneur Seed Capital Fund does. And they at this point have their own board. They have the manager, the professional management of that fund, which is the Vermont Center for Emergency Technologies. Mr. Bradbury joins us from that. And so it's like VITA, it is ultimately a creature of the state, but it also has independence. And the Seed Capital Fund itself, the creation of VITA, when it was charged in statute, it comes with obviously statutory language and parameters around, how it's formed, who it gives money to, its processes, procedures, those types of things. So the proposal in this bill, it builds on that architecture, but it is, it does make modifications because it is, as you'll see in the language, designed to respond to both recapitalize the fund, but also to graft onto that this responsiveness to COVID-related issues. So it's the statutory language. The language in the bill here. It's not actually modifying the underlying statute itself. Rather, it is acknowledging at this point the money that is appropriated in the big bill. It is putting that money to work through the fund, and it is grafting onto the existing statutory language, these elements of a COVID response. So I hope you're all seeing it on your screen at this point.
Yeah, it's on it's on our website under the bill too. I mean, so people can follow along. It's section 13 of the bill.
Yep, 13. I'm on Entrepreneur Seed Capital Fund. So I think A is designed to give everybody sort of a refresher on what it is and what it does. The Seed Capital Fund, created by Vita, is a $5.1 million revolving evergreen capital fund in operation since 2010, serves entrepreneurs and early stage tech-enabled companies for growth, income potential, wealth creation. Since its inception, the fund's portfolio companies have now raised over $182 million. The fund is professionally managed by VSET. In B, I do have, and you're going to see this if we go through your proposal on 159, I have cross-referenced the monies that are in the budget bill to modify that. So here the General Assembly has appropriated the amount of $900,000 from the general fund to the seed capital fund in section G302B to 39 to provide risk stage seed capital to Vermont businesses that have experienced economic disruption, either through reduced business, new business formation, or through an unmanageable increase in new business due to the COVID-19 crisis. So you'll remember that this proposal came forward in a very comparable form earlier in the pandemic, and it was slated or considered for CARES Act funding. And, unfortunately, because that funding was really retrospective and had to do just with loss, not necessarily the complete dynamic of the changing situation for businesses, it was not eligible for CARES Act funding. This $900,000 is in the budget bill. It is general fund, as is the Quebec-based business contracting fund. So those are the two pieces of the total economic development funding in G302 that are actually GF, not ARPA.
Right.
So you'll see in subsection C here, this is basically
before you leave
sure.
subsection B.
Yep.
It reads kind of awkwardly in saying it's to provide risk stage seed capital to Vermont businesses that have experienced economic disruption, either essentially A, through reduced business, B, through new business formation. So I guess I'm having a little trouble understanding how you can experience economic disruption through a new business formation.
Yeah, that's a great observation. I think it's a fair point. It could be new business, or it could, so maybe one class is class A, new businesses. Class B is, businesses that have either had a reduction or have had some dramatic shift and increase. I think your point about the language is the right one. I think it's a policy choice whether new businesses should be part of this. Those are all things I'm happy to work through with you all.
I guess that's a policy question as to whether this money, if it's supposed to be tied to COVID, are we looking to put money out the door for new business formation? And we very well may want to do that, but it'd be hard to say that a business that hasn't formed yet has experienced an economic disruption.
But Mr. Chair, it sort of goes to the concern we were just working on, the language with Joan about new businesses that may have not gotten any help and had just formed, and the whole launch of the business was disrupted by COVID. I think that may be what David's getting at what we're getting at here, but I may be wrong. But the other piece that I think is challenging in that sentence is, or through an unmanageable increase in new business due to COVID. Wow, if somebody has an unmanageable increase in business, why are we helping them at all? I mean, that would be great.
Yeah, I think David probably can speak to these issues. I don't want to have overstated the case about the nexus to COVID. And what I mean by that is you have lots of programs that you have already funded and continue to fund for businesses that, have suffered loss and revenue reductions and need help sustaining through this crisis. But that's not necessarily the nature of the seed capital fund itself, which is to make targeted investments in particular businesses that are at that stage of growth where they need, this kind of targeted funding. So I think that again, I'm going to defer to David about that, but I think that the target market here is different than those other kinds of recovery gap grant program type things.
Well, yeah, we'll definitely talk to David about that. But that's my, I guess, an overarching question I have. I'm unclear. Is this money supposed to be sort of generic money for the seed capital fund, or is it a one-off set aside for businesses that are somehow related to the COVID crisis? Because that's what it seems to say in the appropriation section, that all of this money has to be for businesses that have been impacted by COVID somehow.
Right.
So I don't know what the House intended here. Do they want it broader, or? And then the next question, which I'm sure you're going to get into, is there's no definition of fast capital investment program. So is that what we're creating here? Sort of a new subset of this seed capital fund, a program within the seed capital fund?
Yeah, that's kind of what I meant by grafting onto the existing architecture. I mean, it's still the capital seed fund. It still does what it does, but this whole concept of fast capital investment is just, a twist, I guess. I can't give you all the all the whys and wherefores. I would defer to David on that.
Okay, that's fine.
Mr. Chair, perhaps this language was added when we thought it was going to be eligible for ARPA money. And maybe now, because we'd heard testimony from David Bradbury saying that the fund was down to its last $300,000. I think that's what I remember. And that this was actually to infuse the seed capital fund, not just, and to help businesses that were in this universe that needed help as a result of COVID. But perhaps some of this language could be tweaked now that we know it's not eligible for ARPA money. So that, anyway, if David could address those things, that would be great.
Okay. That's helpful. Thank you.
Let me just get us through the words, and I think I can stop giving you half answers about the purposes. The fast capital program here, you'll see, so notwithstanding underlying statute, it shall invest in businesses consistent with the following: invest in rapid seed and early growth stage employers that have a viable plan for recovery and growth. Shall make expedited investments using simplified investment terms, instruments, stock, convertible notes, forgivable loans, royalty financing, or grants with equity warrants. Expected range is between 20,000 and 100,000. Funds shall prioritize sourcing and funding on BIPOC, veteran, and women-owned businesses. 5, in continuing to serve the Vermont ecosystem, not expanding the expedited program timeline. Funds shall pursue co-investment participation from local and regional investors, including venture funds, families, community foundations, accredited investors, angel investors, etc. And there's a new piece here that is just a proposal for your consideration that, prior to making a seed capital investment, go make sure you've spoken to VITA, take advantage of funds that they may have. That's something new that you guys, I think, you're going to talk about. You'll see there's a limited scope on the eligibility here, that for-profit businesses are eligible except where other significant state appropriated CRF resources have been directed. And at this point, that could be more limited than you want it to be. It might be might also include ARPA or other things. But the excluded sectors are traditional in-person retail operations, lodging, hospitality, real estate, and restaurants and food service.
So this is trying to say that if they could get money, these sectors, if they could get money elsewhere, they would be ineligible for this pot of money?
I think that's the sentiment underlying it, is if there are, particularly, again, this is, this is language we've continued to use now for a while. And remember, from the beginning, all the way back to S350 and the subsequent programs, those were largely focused on businesses that were lodging, hospitality, restaurants, things that were hit hard and closed because of the order. And consequently, so many of the state's resources were directed at those businesses. The intent here was to exclude them if they already had some sort of significant opportunity to receive funds from another source.
Right. And it doesn't strike me that these are businesses that would be fast capital. I mean, a seed and anyway.
So is the fast capital, I think David wrote us a note on this. I can't remember.
Yeah.
Is that a new term that's not in statute somewhere?
That's
Yeah.
correct.
New term. Yep.
Okay. And this is all up until this last section, I think. This is all session law. But I guess we're still struggling whether there's a new program being established here or not. So if somebody wants to appropriate money into more money into fast capital, they'd have to somehow find this law and see that this session law governs it. And I don't know how you segregate the money if you get money back from an entity that would there be like a separate account for these fast capital investments? Or are we just tying ourselves in knots here to try and get around what we thought was CARES relief dollar restrictions? And is the real goal here just to put money into the seed capital fund and not create this new program with all the session law attached to it as to restrictions or policies or priorities? I mean, David can talk to that. Okay, so let's just go on, finish up, and then we'll go to David. This is just a report.
Well, so that's something that's new for your discussion, I suppose. The piece in section 14 concerning the change to 291, that is, as you indicated, that is a change to the statute itself. And I mean, 3B is the new piece. This is talking about the board of the 5 advisors for the fund, and here, as a matter of statute, requiring that appointing authorities would coordinate their appointments to ensure the board comprises advisors with diverse professional and personal backgrounds and experiences, including representation of women and BIPOC identified individuals. That was added in the House side. And then section 15 again is new. This is asking, directing the fund and VITA together to come back to committees of jurisdiction with ideas about, how to integrate preferential treatment or priority, and then give continuing investment opportunities through VITA for businesses that have received capital investments from the fund. So I don't know if that's constructed right. I was not able to hear Cassie's testimony on this, but it's born of what I understand were a couple of suggestions from her.
Okay. We'll hear from David on that. Can we go back to the section 14 for a second? So this is the diversity and representation. Um, I guess we'll have to ask David about this. Who are these people? There's 5 people on the board.
Yes.
Was this
Yes.
in 159? Why am I just not remembering that this was this
Was
in?
that- This was added by House Commerce, yes.
So does this mean that you would have to, if there's a 5-member board and there's no minority diversity on the board now, that you'd have to change the board, the present composition of the board?
I don't believe so. I'll tell you the evolution of the provision, after the discussion concerning the BIPOC Business Support Network, and then the next section was work through VSET, through the Seed Capital Fund. Commerce took a look at that, and the original proposal was to require that the board have a composition that included women or BIPOC identified individuals. I believe currently there are 3 women and 2 men on the board, but you have to ask David to confirm that. Anyway, Commerce, after discussion, the consensus was that they did not want to mandate any particular composition or, alter folks who are there now, but rather as appointments were made over time, they just wanted the appointing authorities to work together, just to try to kind of come to some sort of consensus on achieving a diverse board. And I don't know that it's a particular comment on the lack of diversity right now. I think they just were looking at this prospectively.
Okay. Okay. Um,
Do you
Okay,
want me to
let's-
pull this document down for your discussion with David, or do you want to leave it up?
Let's leave it up if you can. I don't know if David has any way of controlling it, but if you can stand by and help him if he wants to go to any particular sections.
Happy to do that.
It's also on our website
Right.
under David Hall today,
Okay.
if we want to see each other and have it on the side.
Okay. Okay. Thank you, David Hall, and we'll move on to David Bradbury. Welcome, David. Sorry it's taking us so long to get to this. So I'm sure we've made a bunch of mistakes and misstatements along the way. So I'm going to let you talk to us and help educate us about the fund and what you're proposing here. I assume this, from past years, I assume this is your baby, so to speak, in terms of promoting this section.
Great. Good morning, and thank you all. And for the record, I'm David Bradbury, president of the Vermont Center for Emerging Technologies, which acts as the fund manager of the Entrepreneurs Seed Capital Fund, which we refer to as the Vermont Seed Capital Fund, because all of us have trouble spelling entrepreneurs. And we actually found out for inclusivity, it was a very alienating word. So we're starting to use founders or business owners more often. So thank you for the opportunity this morning. I have not been before a committee since 2010 in discussing legislative language. It's usually about other small business startup things. So I appreciate this opportunity. What we're trying to do here is for this legislation is to explain what is sometimes a complex topic, right? In a stage of investing that's very different. Okay. And at the time this was created, Vermont was one of 7 states in the country that didn't have some sort of dotted line to a quasi state supported investment program for equity. And we resolved that in 2009 and 10. VSET, we put $1 million of our own money in, and then the state came up with 4.1 million through VITA, principally through one-time dollars through the ARA program back then. I think specifically to your questions, the fund works, it revolves, we have more demands, we've made more investments. It was impacted by COVID, so some returns of capital over the last almost 18 months now were delayed, okay? And we have increased qualified demand, okay? And we wanted to present a recovery solution back in March, I think David Hall referred to, when we came and said, listen, here's a sector that isn't qualifying for the economic development grants that are put out. The revenues might be going up, but they're losing more money because they don't make all their money on the front end. They might have a SaaS software product that charges over time. Or I think the example we saw was Wheelpad from Southern Vermont that had excess demand for their accessory dwelling units so that they could put people into housing attached to a primary home. So, you know, that was sort of the genesis of coming before the committee. And, you know, what we have today is language that has evolved. It was designed to accept any type of money that might be available, because if I recall, CARES Act was sort of it was an unknown. It was sort of morphing what was and what was available, general funds we didn't know, or other programs. So that, I think, to your question about language and inclusion of situations and company status, for example, or the instrument used, we wanted to be as flexible as possible. I think on line 18, that economic disruption, that was sort of a very much an apparent trigger for trying to get resources into companies that could hire, expand, or create jobs for those permanently displaced. And disruption came in two forms, right? Either no business or too much business. Okay, and that creates equal problems for financing. Let's just take the too much business example. I need to expand my plant. I need a piece of equipment. We had instances of equity rounds collapsing or investors changing the terms. So instead of buying 20% of your company, I wanted 30% of your company. So, and those things are still lingering in the marketplace. So that was the reason there. And then the COVID has created opportunities for businesses we didn't know existed up here. So folks that may have had a situation that was untenable wanted to control their lives and start a new business. Great. They ought to be able to be looked at. They had no history to go after certain grants, right? That federal or other. They didn't have a PPP track record, for example. Why wouldn't we look at those? And then there were others that were in growth mode, but they needed the endorsement of the seed fund to put a little bit of money in to help them syndicate a whole lot of money. And if you recall, for every dollar we've invested to date, there's $7 other dollars or $8 other dollars that come alongside of us. And that's really key to this program is that capital leverage. Because capital it pays payroll, it buys equipment, and it gets the business to a point when it then can access less expensive forms of money or debt, or just operate off internal funds. The Fast Capital name, I think that originated when the governor came out with his $10 million proposal last March. And that was one of two parts for that. And the idea was it was not going to be a new program, a new formal name. It was sort of our commitment to the legislature and to the Vermont public that, listen, we're going to get off our butts and do this faster than normal, responsibly. And the idea wasn't to invest this money over 5 or 6 years, right? It was to address the acute need for growth, recovery, and new business formation. So that is sort of, it's an intentionality, okay, rather than a separate program or a separate sort of accounting element. The expedited process is important. Again, it was designed with the intention of like, okay, we had 100 companies we were tracking. There may be 50 that this form of capital is appropriate or more, I don't know. And then we need to qualify those and get those into expedited investment documentation, one that's acceptable to the fund and the rules and the eligibility tests and the sort of playbook that we have, but also that would leverage other people's money alongside this. Okay, so that was very much a part of the intentionality of getting the money out the door. And we can call it whatever you want. We don't have to call it anything new, but that was sort of the holdover language, if you will, as we've talked about this last March, in September, and now again this spring. And I think the other point that I heard come up was around the advisory board and that composition. We're very much in support of this language. We all need to be more transparent, more committed, visibly, that we're going to make our efforts to be more inclusive and representative of all sorts of folks that will seek capital. Currently, the membership is Cassie Polhemus, Gwen Pacalo from Center on Women in Enterprise, Hinda Miller, former senator who helped create this. I keep holding on to Hinda. I won't let her go for a bit. She keeps threatening, but and then Andrew Allen, who's a serial entrepreneur and who has really that sort of investor side and empathy as an entrepreneur. And then we just had a retirement of Bob Britt, who was a CFO for a long time for big and small companies alike. We do currently have an invitation out. Cassie and I did work together prior to this language for another individual with a finance background, an entrepreneur's background, and that also meets the intentionality of this new clause. So I feel like we're going to fulfill that. I want it in this, okay? And it's consistent with what VSET's been working on for a couple of years now. And we have a ways to go for sure, but happy to take any questions on that. But it was important at the House side, if I recall. And
David, who makes the decisions as to who gets the grants and how much the grants are for?
Right. So the investment process is there's a 3-person investment committee. Okay. The VSET team and staff, our mentors, any other sort of expert that we need, will sort of source and validate the capital seeker. We will conduct due diligence, see if this money is appropriate or if there's a better source. We'll point out various lending partners, other angel investors, et cetera. So it's very active that we're proactive rather in terms of these are the available capital sources in and outside of Vermont for your situation, your business, your stage, your sector. The investment decisions are made by the 3-person investment committee. It's by design, myself representing VSET, and then the other 2 parties are volunteers, Ken Merritt, who's a longtime angel investor, ecosystem champion, and the entrepreneur's lawyer, by and large. And then Jim Robinson is the second volunteer. And Jim has been an early stage fund formation person. He helped set up Fresh X Capital, a similar fund in Florida. Is an active private and institutional investor as well. So, and then we invite others as need be to come into the table. My partner here at VSET, Sam Roach Gerber, she's been involved, and prior to that, other team members. So ultimately we make the decision and we sign on the dotted line, okay, and live with the results, and then work with the companies pre-investment, during the investment process, right, the capital process, and then post-investment. And post-investment is where the real work starts, right? I mean, that is, I think I referred in one of my emails, it's a contact sport, right? You pushing back, pulling up, being engaged consistently and productively is what we do until they're, as long as they're in the portfolio and even thereafter when they continue to seek some help. So those were I think the areas within David Hall's read that I heard people commenting about, but if I missed one, happy to circle back or take other questions that you might have. And why this really matters at this moment in time. Okay. You've heard from anywhere between 9 and 12 companies that have emailed you individually, or I have put together to committee explaining their situation. Okay, I take their word more than mine. we're here because the good work and the programs that the state and the private sector have done has created a bubble of demand, right? Where we can rise up and create jobs and earn our way toward a prosperous future across Vermont. Okay. And at the same time, there's been disruption in these capital markets. First time checks, right, which is where we play the biggest role, are at an all-time low. They're more expensive. They've always been tough. Now they're even tougher. Okay. And that's a real problem. So we have rising qualified demand, and we've had shrinking sort of capacity. And this is what we're trying to fill in a small way at this moment. So, and it's all sorts of companies and sectors.
So I have a couple of questions. Could some of these businesses that come to you for help, could they also be going to ACCD for economic recovery grants?
They could, depending on how long they had been around. I mean, one of the challenges, if you recall, with Ted Brady and Joan, we were trying to, not all of them had revenue drop, right? They actually had revenue increase, but they were losing more money. And that was keying off revenue top line.
Right.
So I don't know, we can ask that. Ultimately we try to look at like, what are you trying to build and do? Okay. How it fits within Vermont, within our guiding statutes and eligibility. Is it hitting one of our 4 investment objectives, right? Which is return to revolve, capital leverage, payroll growth, and other, this sort of synergistic other factor consideration. And then how much capital does it take minimally to get there? And how can this fund play a key role at a moment in time? And I think Senator Clarkson, I've used that example about Green Mountain Digital and Yonder, right? It would not have gotten its first $2 million round. And I think that number is wrong, but it was without our $100,000 commitment. And I sent numbers previously. We lost that money. That one failed after 7 years. It raised over $9 million in other people's capital. 90% of that went to local payroll. So when we look at ROI of 100,000 in, we look at the 10% on 900,000, call it, there are all sorts of returns. So that is the holistic view, but very much we're trying to get these funds deployed into companies that have high potential people, whether they're first time or third time entrepreneurs, and has a high opportunity business that we think can be successful. And it doesn't have to be $1 billion unicorn. It could be a more reasonable, this is what I want to do in our community, right? And 15 jobs in Woodstock or East Rygate. We funded an energy thermal storage company. We've got other financial tech companies, energy storage. It's less important that we want to see is it right size to Waterbury Center or to Middlebury or Bennington. So I don't know if that helped answer it, but that's sort of the mindset, the process that we use.
I assume you do this anyhow, but if the statutes or if this bill specifically said that you should factor in other state and federal COVID funding sources in your decision, I assume you are doing that now, but that wouldn't be problematic to you, would it?
No, but I think as a practical matter, like what's the guidance if if they got a $30,000 economic recovery grant a year ago, but now they're in the need for outside capital? Is that precluded, or do we just factor that into the whole situation?
I mean, I don't know. I think it's just saying the legislature might be sensitive to people going to 2 pots of money as opposed to a business that can only go to 1 pot of money.
Right.
That's, I think, essentially.
In all fairness, Mr. Chair, I think businesses are going to as many pots of money as they can possibly go to make it through. So, I mean, we've seen our businesses go to PPP, EIDL, the state. I mean, they've gone everywhere.
No, I know.
So I think,
and that's why we have focused in the last rounds on places that have gotten no money.
Right,
Um,
exactly.
But
Mr. Chair, if I could add on that, I mean, I think the example I go to, and she's provided testimony, so I feel comfortable talking, is Julie Lineberger at Wheelpad again. Okay, their company, again, the disruption of COVID was, oh my gosh, how do I keep the lights on and my people employed, right? They access whatever program was available. Okay, but now they have unprecedented growth, right? And let's say you wanted to create a new facility and add 12 jobs in Wilmington or thereabouts. Like, I need a little bit of outside money to do that. That is a situation we're looking at. Okay, this is not a commitment to invest in the company there. Okay, I should say that, but that is a real example. And I wouldn't want to prejudice somebody for keeping the lights on for the last year.
Okay. The bill specifically says it's expected that the grants will be in the $20,000 to $50,000 range. I'm wondering, it's sort of an odd sentence. I mean, usually we would mandate that they be in the $20,000 to $50,000 range. What's the history of that line, and
Sure.
how effective would that be for you?
That was intended to sort of signal and describe, under this concept of getting the money out the door, what would be a reasonable range of investment. It was a question that was coming up, and the current fund has no statutory amount, right? There isn't a dollar figure. There's a limit, no bigger than 15% of the fund. But in our proposal, in our contracts to manage the fund with VITA, and we got more legal documents than I care to admit. We do describe these are the sort of projects we're looking at. Okay, $20,000 might make a difference if someone's raising $200,000, for example, right? If someone's raising $1 million, maybe it's $100,000, and it's situational. And this was also an opportunity to show, how many companies could be supported with whatever level of funding that came through.
What is the maximum that you could grant presently?
We wouldn't grant. We would invest ultimately through equity. It would be over. It's a percentage of total capitalization. So 5.1 million. Assume this 900,000. That's $6 million. 15% would be the upper limit of that. Okay, but we're nowhere near that as a practical matter. Like our experience, our modeling, our peers that we see around the country. You don't want to overcommit to just one. Our goal is not to own 30% of one company, right? It sort of goes, we want the entrepreneurs to own as much. We'd rather then move off and support other aspiring entrepreneurs or folks that have need to grow their business.
So you have like $350,000 available in the capital seed fund. Is that right, presently?
Our cash balance is a little over $300,000. Part of that will need to support the management fees of the fund, right? The operating admin of the fund each year. And, we're hoping to make another 2 investments here at a smaller dollar level very shortly.
So I guess I'll phrase the question this way. When you get this, let's assume you get this $900,000 for the fund, under this law that we're passing, are there guidelines or restrictions on that money that exist on the 300,000 right now?
Yes. Yeah. So this money, this new appropriation would need to fit within I think David Hall used the word graft or grafting. I've never heard the word graft used in a positive sense, so I'm smiling.
Think apple trees.
Oh yeah, great, perfect. Okay, now I love it. To be eligible for the seed fund to consider you, right? You need to have Vermont presence, right? That's greater than, it's 50% or more full-time employees at the time of investment in Vermont. Okay, so that's something that we do. You need to have revenues that are under $1 million for 80% of the situation, and it can go up to under $3 million in revenue. So that's sort of the stage, that smaller stage. And $3 million might sound big, but for some companies, that's 3 machines. So it's a little risky, or 10 housing units. Other criteria for investing have to do with, we have a focus on energy sector. That was an originating statute piece. So there's 10% of the fund needs to support energy efficiency, things related to new equipment that is more energy efficient, et cetera. So it might be semiconductor equipment, or it could be battery storage. So that was a priority set up back in the day, and also reflected a small piece of money that came into the fund that wasn't being used by, I think there was something called the Clean Energy Fund or Clean Energy Development Fund at one point. And that may have been $500,000 that came in. So that's how the 10 million came about. And, the other sort of things that we look at are really around the due diligence, right? The customer referrals, are these people that we would entrust with the funds that we're responsible for? Do we see a road to success for this business? Are we willing to be patient? So things like that.
These are the basic qualifications for eligibility or getting the money. Now with this 900,000, you're saying there's going to be added restrictions or requirements or focus?
Yeah, I think this is saying we're going to need to establish some nexus to COVID, right? Disruption as defined here. There's a priority to source and to seek and to be supportive of BIPOC and women-owned businesses. We also include veteran as well, and then the sentence around, do they need the money because they've accessed a lot of other state or federal programs, right? And we would see that very clearly either on their balance sheet that they have a PP loan, for example, a PPP loan, or that they might have an existing community fund loan, or that they've taken in a recovery grant. So we would look at those things, and if their cash account was flush, we'd be like, well, you don't really need this from our source, and we would go maybe look for somebody else.
So when the money if you get some return on your investment and some of this money comes back, your equity interest comes back to you, is that money going to be segregated for the same purposes, or is it going to go into the general pot of money?
I suppose that's open for discussion. I would suggest it would just go back into the fund itself after the first revolve, because those COVID conditions will have gone. The amount of money that we talk about, 20,000, 100, that's consistent with what we do. And
yeah,
anyway, that's what I would think.
I would tend to agree. I don't, so because as we've heard, it takes a long time for these companies to revolve back in. So, one of the reasons the fund is down to 300,000 is that not that many companies have sold, or the revolving piece has yet to really make it, I would say, long-term sustainable on its own revolvingness. I think that's what David's testimony was earlier. David, as I recall, have any companies revolved back? How many companies have actually done well enough or sold enough or hit their targets to actually kick their revolving piece back in?
Right. And one of my follow-up emails here, and I'm sorry, I keep referring to your email inboxes. We've had 4 transactions from 3 companies. Okay. And we have revolved, I think, our first investment 4 years later, return monies. And then we sold off 2 portions of another long-held investment for gains that went back. And then the third company, we actually wanted to hold on to that, but we found an unbelievable local investor, but a very well-known, nationally known angel. And we're like, we need this person in the company. And there was no room because we'd already done the round. And we said, listen, given our mission, like, you're the other factor now. So we did a private sale and took money back, made a little bit, and then we've gone out and done another 5 investments on top of the 16 we thought we would do. I will say too that not all the companies have been invested in since 2010, right? It took good 4 years to our charge was get it out the door because the world's ending, the financial crisis, right? So we did 6 companies, we did 12 companies in the first 2 years. Okay. And then we're like, okay, we learned some things. Let's pace it out. And I will say, even when the fund doesn't put money in, because maybe the terms aren't safe enough or good enough, we still work with companies to get themselves other people's money as appropriate. So that's sort of bundled into this, but we don't put those numbers in our reports and things like that.
Okay. David, thank you very much. I have one additional question. Does anybody have any other questions for David at this point?
Randy?
I do.
Senator Brock?
And this is perhaps for both Davids. I'm looking at the bill, and let me just get it back in front of me here for a second. I'm looking at, it's on page 29. It's relates to section 14, 3B, regarding the appointments to the board. It mentions appointments to the board with diverse professional and personal backgrounds and experiences, including representation of women and BIPOC identified individuals. What does that mean in terms of appointments?
I can speak to it. So currently, the VITA president or the VITA organization has the right to appoint 2 people. VSET appoints 2 people. And then the 5th position is sort of a mutually agreed appointment, sort of like you'd see a standard 2-2-1 on a private board. Okay. And so that's the process.
Well, it says it will coordinate their appointments. So as the board contains people, including representation of women and BIPOC identified individuals. This is a 5-person board. Does that say, at least as I read it, that it must include 1 woman and 1 BIPOC identified individual? Is that what that says?
I think that's more a question. If it's new language, I think that's more a question for David Hall.
Yeah, that's why I mentioned both Davids.
So David Hall here. Again, as I said, I think the Commerce Committee added this language and did not intend to mandate any number of any individual of gender or other background. They started in that place. I think they even started off expanding the board, but then basically after discussion, came to what I think the intent underlying at least is that what mattered to them was diverse professional and personal backgrounds and experiences. And the including language, of course, in our statutes, including means including but not limited to. They did want to still reference representation of women and BIPOC identified individuals, but they did not want to either limit this concept of diversity to just those 2 groups or to mandate any certain number of positions be reserved for X, Y, or Z person. They just said what we care about is getting the best people to do the best job, and that should include people who have diverse backgrounds and experiences. So that
Well,
was
I
the
certainly
so-called-
understand that, but as I read literally what this says to me is that the board or the appointing authorities must ensure that the composition of the board includes representation of women and BIPOC identified individuals. I mean,
Yeah, I think you
that's
have to
the
read
official
it.
language of what it says.
I think you have to read it in conjunction with diverse professional and personal backgrounds and experiences, and as examples of diversity, if you will, includes but is not limited to women and BIPOC identified individuals. I mean, it doesn't, if you want to soften that up, you could maybe say, which may include or something like that, but. Or
Well,
you could
may
just-
include would be fine, but the way I read that, I read a
Sure.
quota. I said,
Okay.
well, the way I read that is it says it must ensure.
It must ensure advisors with diverse professional and personal backgrounds and experiences. And the reason that the insurer can't be limited to include just women and just BIPOC identified individuals is because in our statutes, including is non-exhaustive. So it could include anybody, but those are just two examples. I hear you though, and I think you could either strike the including clause or you could change it to soften it again to say which may include. But I think, that was not the intent to mandate anything more than the consideration of personal and professional backgrounds.
If that's all it was intended, I would be happy to leave it at that. I'm not sure how the rest of the committee feels.
I think with that
That's all
understanding,
it's intended.
I think this is good as it is. But
You're muted, Senator Sorokin.
I sort of read it the way David explains it. I think that
Yeah.
sounds to me like that was the intent. Maybe it could be more clear, but I think it was perspective only, and those should be considerations in future appointments. But I don't necessarily read it as a quota, but maybe we can work on clarifying language, and it doesn't seem to be a problem given that the way David expresses it as the intent of the House. It doesn't sound like the House would have a problem with clarifying language if it's a problem to some members of the committee, as long as we're all agreeing.
If that's what's intended, if the language were clarified, I'd be happy with it. If the language reads as it is, I have a problem with it.
Okay. Well, we'll talk about that a little bit more. I wanted to ask one other question of David Bradbury. You mentioned something about the $10 million, that this was part of the $10 million. I've always been somewhat unclear as to whether the administration is supporting this provision. Is this their idea, your idea? Have they been supportive in the past? You made it sound like the $10 million I'm thinking of was in the Budget Adjustment Act and then subsequently in H315. And I don't think I ever heard that this money was a piece of that $10 million. So if you could clarify that for me.
and Mr. Chair, Ken is here for ACCD.
Okay. We're going to get to Ken next. But
No, but I mean, he's administration.
yes.
The 10 million was, I believe, was called Phase 2 recovery proposal that was last March by the governor. And then the complications as rules became known about using equity under the CARES Act became a whole jumble that we may recall. So, I mean, again, at the time, Ted Brady, Joan Goldstein last spring, and as latest as this week here, has indicated support for this. So, or not objection to it. I don't know what the
Okay.
nuances are.
Okay. Thank you.
Yep.
Okay. Anything else, committee, on seed capital? I'm going to suggest we take a 5-minute break and come back at 10:46, and we'll go into capital investment grants, the $11 million that's in the budget for the balance of our time. And we'll hear from Ken Jones and Megan Sullivan and whoever else is here from the administration.